Here we are at Chökar, which was once a very important part of the old sailing itinerary up from Denmark along the Swedish coast across to Åland and then into the Gulf of Finland and as far away as Russia. The reason it's an important place is that it is one of the few islands in these parts that have 4 sheltered harbors in different parts of the island. That means that whichever way you come and whichever wind is blowing, you have a fair chance of actually finding safe harbor. We even had a harbor called Mother's Womb because when you got into it, you were really as safe as you were in the womb. Here you come and look at the compass, which was laid down in medieval days. In the 13th century, you know that the magnetic North Pole deviates over time, and this is spot on the medieval deviation. Now this is the church landing where the priest and his little family arrived in the book and in the opera. I can't vouch for the exact location of the then landing, but this is certainly the area. And in those days, all parishioners mainly would have arrived at the church by boat. So you must imagine this little bay full of boats. It's also here that all main visitors arrived. In the book and in the opera we have the installation of the new priest, and the bishop and his dignitaries arrived from the mainland, brought here by the Coast Guard, which in those days served as our link with the outside world. It's also the guests for the funeral then, towards the end of the book and the opera, that arrive here and were received in waves upon waves of guests and visitors. Again, now you see a lot of trees, whereas in those days this would have been completely barren, and the very ground would have been grazed down to the roots of all the grass. None of these alders, none at all of these very tall trees. To me, of course, these tall trees are an aberration, but I do know that they give shelter, and a landscape is changing before our very eyes. That's the nature of landscapes. I try to tell myself that this is a natural development we are watching.
I am Betsy Norgard, and I'm here today with Hanna Wagner, and we are both part of Finlandia Foundation National's Board of Trustees. We are in the Åland Islands in Finland, in beautiful Chökar, talking with author Ulla-Lena Lundberg about her novel Ice. In 2012, when Ice was published, it received the Finlandia Prize, Finland's highest honor for literature. In 2016, an English translation of it was also published. It has become very popular in Finland and among readers. In 2019, Jaakko Kuusisto, musician and composer, was chosen to compose an opera Ice, and it also was very popular with viewers.
You named your novel Ice. Could you tell us why you did it, and also tell us why you think the novel was so popular?
I named it Ice because it introduced itself as ice. The title is usually something that comes late in the work, but in this case it was so obvious. I don't know how much I am allowed to tell you about the contents, but ice features very prominently, and also ice has many other connotations. You could speak about the ice that builds around the heart. You could mention it in other ways, but here I really do mean it in a stark, concrete form. This is ice. And why it was so popular, first I could have answered truthfully, I have no idea. And the second thought was that it was particularly popular in its Finnish version. And I thought the translation must be better than the original. And then I realized that it was simply because it had more readers in Finnish, that the Finnish support seemed so overwhelming, because what the book is really about is about the austerity on the one hand after the war in Finland, and also the kind of hope that was experienced in Finland. We had got through the war and we had preserved a kind of independence in a way that was almost miraculous. And out of all that suffering and loss and tremendous individual sorrow, there grew some kind of hope, because we were experiencing year by year that things were getting better. This book is also celebrating the fact that little by little more things became available. You had a little more freedom of movement. Things were slowly improving. Also, you had the sense that this hope that was spreading really came at a price. And I think that the conditions we all shared in Finland had never been more pronouncedly shared than it was then, because the conditions were the same for us. And I had heaps of letters from clergymen, elderly clergymen all over Finland, all the way to Lapland. From Lapland I had a letter saying, you know, this is exactly how it was with us. And of course the Lutheran Church, which was a state church, had very similar or you could say identical procedures, rules, rituals, and everybody of the older generation could recognize parts of their lives in this book. And I think that it's really this part of recognition that made it so well read. And I might add that the majority of the readers were belonged to the older generation, and I think every grandmother in the land had at least 2 copies for Christmas.
Thank you. The book is about a young Lutheran minister who is appointed to a church in the outer islands of the archipelago, and arrives there with his young family with many expectations for a long period. You are also a Lutheran minister's daughter. In fact, I think you were born in this very room. Can you talk a little bit about what in the book you bring from your life and what and how you deal with that?
Well, it's no secret that this book is in a way modeled on my own family history, but before I myself had any memory of it. I was a year and a half when my father died. I have no personal memories of him. He's a fictional character in the sense that I have assembled him from various bits, I have been told. And of course, I come from a very talkative background, which helps. Everybody talked about people, things, how things were. I think I was in the picture, and above all, I did not lose kökar. After my father's death, we moved away, but my mother was a teacher, and in those days, a teacher had a 3-month vacation. We arrived here in the beginning of June and left at the end of August, and for a child, that's an immensely long time. And I really feel that kökar was my inheritance from my father, and I have always loved this island and particularly its people, and have had a very warm relationship to it. So in that sense, this book is autobiographical, but I have signaled by not using real names, not even of the islands. I call them Öarna, which means skerries, the parish of the skerries. And this is to say that when you write fiction, you will in fact bring in other sides than you do when you write documentarism. And what you read here is removed from the reality as it was perceived by certain individuals. I have had different versions of my father's death, for instance. I have had people described in very different ways. And you have to absorb the information you have, and then at some point you leave it and go with the flow, go with the intuition, go with whichever way these people present themselves to me.
Can you talk a little bit? I know that when we visited the church, we saw things, and you would say, well, this, if you remember in the book, this was reflected as this. Or can you mention a few of those? I think that's interesting.
Yes, there are some things in the church that have great importance, especially in the chapter where the priest is about to give his first sermon and is understandably very, very nervous. And then and there the parish comes in. He's nervous of the parish, who are very experienced people who are quite of the previous priest. They said that he could preach, but he couldn't sing. And Petter, this new young pastor, he can sing, but he's sure that they're going to say that he can sing, but he can't preach. And then, you know, when he starts off with the liturgy, and it turns out that they can sing the responses and they answer promptly and warmly, and he's sort of pulled in. And then the pulpit, and he climbs up and he feels just this void, and what is he going to say, and what if no word comes out, and that sort of thing. So of course this has its very, very concrete setting, and for me place is everything. Place is what is important for whichever book I'm writing. And there is also the scene, the Christmas night, when Park Victory founders outside Ute, and they receive word from one of the pilots that this has just happened, and you know, the strong symbolism that the opera was better, I think, than my book to bring out. I was impressed by how the opera handled that, but we'll get back to that at some point.
And the Park Victory was a ship?
The Park Victory was a great American ship.
That had crashed and sank?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And there was a storm, and the pilots were busy with another ship, and it's simply, and its anchors did not hold, and it was simply tossed about. And there were 11 casualties, but many more were saved. Mm-hmm. And of course, the telling of the news is taking place in the church, and it's in the church that the priest is ordained as vicar of Kökar and so on with the arriving visitors. And the church is an important place, and the opera itself has a few little winks to they lend the chandeliers, for instance. There are pictures from the pulpit that you can see in the opera and so on, but it's only little sketches. They are not trying to recreate the whole milieu, but I think they do it very nicely.
So when you're writing about a place that you know so well, fact and fiction seems to blend a little bit. Can you talk about the idea of an author using, sort of mixing facts and fiction when you are talking about something that's so close to you?
Well, this is something I've thought about a lot, and at my age I have lots and lots of colleagues who have talked about this sort of thing, and I think that there's one thing we can say about fictional writing, and that is that it draws on a fact. Imagination itself is not out there. Imagination is coming from inside. It's coming from your from your feelings, your thoughts, your musings on things. And I think if you don't know anything about a book, you said that you read Ice without having any idea that there was any kind of autobiographical content. And I said that's exactly how it should be. Because for an author it's quite a tedious business this to say, to answer questions like, did it really happen like that, were people really like that, and was it actually that person you were referring to, and so on. And that's part of it, but it's not important. And often I have written quite a few books which touch on Tjökar in some ways or others, and that's always the question, to what extent is this real? And I say that when you read a novel set in London, Paris, or New York, you don't ask these questions. You take them as this is where the book is set. Right. And I know that almost any book, it stems from the writer's experiences, feelings, understanding of things, but then it takes leave of this literal interpretation of people, places, and what happens. And I have always made sure that. Or been aware of the difference between fact and fiction. I have written a lot of fact, no problem about that. I've written about rock art, which is a great interest of mine, both in a book of facts, and I have written about it in fictional form, set about 2,000 years ago. And that's fiction, because you could say that factually you can't really get inside the period, which I can. I'm also an anthropologist, and they say in anthropology that it is not a method that they advise you to use where you say, if I were a medieval housewife, if I were a medieval knight, I would do this and that, or if I were a horse, I would do this. But I say that the glory of fiction is that I can not only be the horse, I can not only speak as if I were a horse, but I can be the horse. That's the great thing. In fiction, I love fiction, and in fiction you can actually forget about yourself and you can assume the person, the identity of somebody quite different, who will still retain great parts of yourself. That's unavoidable. But it's a world where you have a lot of freedom which you don't have. In factual literature, the facts decide what you write. But in fiction, you decide what you write. And there's a great joy in that.
Thank you.
One character that was very interesting to me in the book was Mona, Petter's wife.
Yeah.
And she brought her life was very different, I think, than the way many parishioners expected to be. She had studied animal husbandry, and she had cows, and she milked them every day, and she cared for animals. And can you talk? But she was a very strong person also. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how you?
And she was also impatient, and she was incredibly impatient, and she was quick, and she was angry, and there was no real rest in her. And to get back to the opera for a bit, I thought her part was done extremely well. I was impressed by the director, Anna Kello, and I said to her that how could you know that my mother was just like that. And she said, well, I read your book. And I said that, yes, but I mean, not really, just not like that. Some people think she was overstated in the opera, whereas I think my mother was a woman of gestures, of this sort of palpable impatience. She could not be still. And she got a lot done, and I can safely say that my father's popularity on the island stemmed from the fact that she freed him of the time to spend a lot of time out there in the parish with people, and she kept the whole show running here. And she had a rough deal, perhaps. But I agree with you, and I don't think at all that she is a negative or unattractive person. You just don't expect her kind of character in the pastor's wife. And a lot of people think she's hard to her children, but I think that she had to be efficient every minute of the day. And when you are that efficient, you can't really. You have to, it was interesting in later life when my mother would list the things that she had to do in a day, and my sister and I came very low on that list. So she didn't have all that time to spend, and we had to sort of behave and play according to the rules.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I have great respect for my mother, and I think she was also, after Tjökar, she was she was quite fantastic in the things she manages to do. She always said that it was a wonderful thing that I had my teacher's qualifications. What would we have done? And when I tell people here, they laugh and said she could have done anything. and I think that's true. Yeah. She really was that sort of person.
Interesting. Well, in talking about the opera, when you mention it now, how were you involved at all in the creation, or working, or responding, or in any way?
I'm glad you asked me that, because I knew of colleagues of mine who had had operas made, and first of all, though, I was pleased. I was waiting for the opera to come along. I turned down a lot of theaters because I didn't want to have quickly made plays, very very realistic ones, where the pastor was nice and the pastor's wife shouted, and I wanted something that was lacking in the opera, that is the music, because the book is very much about how things sound. The whole environment, climate, weather. There's also all these powers that are not quite visible except to a few people, that require a whole different sort of background. And I thought this is what music could do. And eventually various composers started to contact me, and I thought they had the right idea, but you have to have a place for an opera. It's not that you just get the idea and then you search for 50 years for somewhere to put it up. So it was when the National Opera in Helsinki got in touch that we could actually make it. And I thought hard about the fact that I had the rights to sort of sit in when they made the opera. And I thought too that I want a different art form. I just don't want a book set to music. And the opera is an art form in itself, and I am not a competent composer. I'm not a director of operas. I have no idea of these things. And in that case, I thought, let those who can do it work in peace, because I could see myself sit there and hone in on things that were not right and know it and over my dead body, and this is not right, and so on. So I decided that the greatest gift I could give the production was to stay away. I actually had nothing to do with it until I saw it at the dress rehearsal the night before the premiere. And then I thought I would have to muster all my restraint and all my diplomacy, but I didn't. I was really quite moved in the end, and hugely delighted, because it wasn't my book. It was an art form that was different, and I who had actually written the book could actually take it in and be moved by it.
That's great. That's wonderful. Yeah.
I'm really pleased in the end.
Among viewers.
Well, yes, to some extent, and of course, if I look at it with a cold eye, I could say that there are things that are wrong and just couldn't have happened in those days. There are great anachronisms. They did not, in fact, emphasize this austerity. That was so much part of the book, and you know, the kind of fantastic lavish feast that they laid on at the opera at the installation of the vicar would not have happened in real life. I could have jumped on all that and said absolutely not, and I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't. There are a couple of things I could have interfered in, but once I did, and they misunderstood me completely, so I thought, no use.
A scary thought that opera would be like real life. I mean, as an art form.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
It's always sort of more than it's bigger than life.
Exactly.
Larger than life.
Yes. Yes, but still, you know, factual faults might have been removed in some cases. But you know, I made that decision, and I'm not sorry.
I felt that the landscape was a big character in the book. And,
I agree, certainly.
And I would like you to comment whether you, as writing it, also felt, and what about the landscape you wanted to portray to the reader.
To tell the truth, I wasn't thinking about the reader more than very occasionally, but I was thinking very much about the world out here. I actually, in my 20s, I wrote a book about Tjökar called quite simply Tjökar. And this is about work in Tjökar and also culture, pleasures, that sort of thing, but it's mainly composed of interviews. And this is really where I cut my teeth as an author. I learned a lot of things from these interviews. And in the course of work, which was mainly fishing in the early days, I came into contact with these powers that are outside our immediate view, but can be felt like a kind of presence when this man who takes the post to the islands and is out on the water every day and does a lot of fishing, he is always aware that he's being guided, he feels, by these powers out there. And he tries to tell the priest who he's talking about what they are like, and he says that they are people that were old when Jesus was young. And he's saying that he's talking about a world before Christ, but in somehow very, very strongly connected with the dead, because some of the younger powers are actually dead people. For instance, when they save the sailors from the Park Victory, he says that he could he felt that older gone pilots were actually there helping him, because they knew when to turn the boats, they knew, and they were helping all along. And many of these powers are helpful. Others are so old that they have forgotten what it's like to be human. And this is another thing which I think the opera did extremely well. It's a visual medium, apart from being a musical one, and they demonstrated the closeness of the dead and this whole world of powers that have no name. And it's common in many old religions that you did not mention these sacred beings. And you had nicknames for them, like old men and the old man of the so-and-so scary and that. But so the powers is not the right term, because there is no real term for them, but it's a world of people who have passed out of this world, who are somehow still still able to guide people who are sensitive to their presence. And this Anton, who is telling the priest about these things, is, in my view, a very, very sensitive person. He's out there in the weather all the time, and he has learned to listen. He can listen to the wind. He can feel changes in the weather before he can be aware of them. And this ability of his, he translates into the fact that he's being guided along.
Yeah, I found it really interesting when you talked about these powers when we go back to ice, you know, that they would guide you across the ice and that you couldn't turn back.
No.
You know, you had to keep going because you would
if you are on really thin ice, it won't carry you the second time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that was really important to those people, and they had to.
They listened to the ice and they listened to the weather.
Yeah.
But they also had sensible precautions. They had ice picks, and they had always carried a knife so that you could actually heave yourself up from the ice, and the priest didn't.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
yeah.
Do you think that the setting in the islands and in the far outer islands especially, do you think that people elsewhere, say in Finland, find that, do you think they might have been inspired by that book to come visit? Do you think that would help tourism?
I think that in a sense it has, yes.
I would agree, because I think, you know, it's a very different life and a very different culture, and you know.
But yet in Finland there is still remnants of that sort of thing. The Sami were shamanistic people until quite recently, so we're talking about 100 years or something like that. And it's all part of this old feeling where you're very, very close to nature. And nature is almost like, so this is coming back to your question about landscape, that this landscape is imbued with qualities and almost features, inward features rather than the landscape that you can read at a glance. And I always remember the old fishermen, you know, this early book from the 1970s, and I often think that if I had only been older and more experienced, but then I think, well, I don't think I could have asked better questions, because this is a world you don't really ask questions because you're not going to get straight answers. Yeah. You have to sort of enter this sort of world of feeling. This is not a world of the intellect. This is a world of feeling, intuition, thoughts. I think I would have been much more academic in my outlook if I hadn't been on Chökar so early and been so interested in the stories they told me about the old men of various skerries and the narrow escapes they had thanks to being pointed in the right direction and being told to leave your nets in the sea and just go straight home. And the story always and you know that this terrific storm came and we managed to get behind a big island in the nick of time and that sort of thing. Yeah. And Post Anton himself, who was actually a real person, my model for it, he had like a formula. All his stories ended and I got home dry shot. So he didn't. And let's see, somewhere here. Never mind if I can't find him. I might read. So I think this was my real university, and I think that I got a more many-sided education from knowing Chökar. And they were all very proud of the fact that the old ones, they had gone to the school of life, they said.
That's right, yeah. Well, this was your non-fiction book.
This was my non-fiction book, and this is my fiction.
Book.
I've also written other fiction about Chökar. So it features quite prominently in my production. I've written about 22 or 23 books, and I would say that roughly 1/5 of that is Chökar. Sällan är det så bra isar och många är ute och frestar på dem. Det är mycket besök mellan byarna och knutdansar på lördagskvällarna. Alla människor är i farten och mörkret är inget hinder. Också hos prästens blir det kvällsbjudning. De har vänner på öronen sedan sin första dag och många att tacka för hjälp och råd och dåd, och ett nöje är det alltid att få se deras glada och vänliga ansikten. Det är Klockan och Francine och Väktaren och Signe, Adele Bergman och Elis och Lydia och Artur Manström. Det är alltid mycket att tala om, och med fader Leonard i huset är det en kamp om mordet. Här noterar prästen med en viss tillfredsställelse att han funnit om inte sina övermän så åtminstone sina likar. Talet strömmar så friskt som man någonsin kan önska, och ansiktena är glada och välvilliga och fulla av intresse.